The morning began with a promise of victory, clear skies, high morale, and a confident push through the outskirts of a small French village. Captain Erwin Harker, commander of the 2nd Armored Battalion's C Company, had led his tank column through worse fights before. But by noon, that promise had turned into a nightmare. Enemy reconnaissance had been faster than intelligence predicted. German panzers and infantry, supported by deadly artillery, swept around the flanks like wolves closing in on their prey. 3 Allied infantry units, supported by Harker's tanks, found themselves deep in a pocket with no clear retreat. Radio communications flickered in and out, supply lines were cut, and visibility dropped as artillery shells churned the earth into dust. Command on the other end of the radio insisted the units hold their position. Reinforcements, they said, were on the way. But Harker had seen this before. He'd fought long enough to recognize the pattern. When higher-ups said, "Hold the line," it often meant, "Prepare to die." His tanks were already running low on fuel and ammunition. Infantry morale was collapsing, and the enemy was closing from both sides. He needed to act, but his options were limited. The one thing he had plenty of was smoke shells. Thick, white phosphorus smoke that could blind an enemy's line of sight. But command had issued strict orders. Smoke shells are for coordinated withdrawal or cover fire, not independent use. Unauthorized use could mean disciplinary action. For Harker, the rule made sense in theory. Smoke could confuse friendly units, interfere with air support, or signal retreat to the enemy. But in the hellish confusion of that moment, following protocol meant certain destruction. He looked through his periscope at the ridge line, enemy tanks advancing in formation, infantry creeping through the hedgerows. The encirclement was tightening. Every minute counted. Harker made a choice that would haunt and define him. "Load smoke," he barked. His gunner hesitated. "Sir, smoke's restricted unless." "Load it." Harker's voice cut through the gunfire. "That's an order." Within seconds, the first smoke shell exploded downrange, blooming into a wall of thick, white fog. Then another, and another. Harker ordered the entire platoon to fire smoke in staggered intervals, forming layers, not just in front, but behind, to mask their movement in both directions. The enemy, expecting direct engagement, was suddenly blinded by a shifting haze that covered half a kilometer of battlefield. To the untrained eye, it looked like chaos. But Harker's plan had precision. Using the smoke as both shield and signal, he coordinated over short-range radio to guide the trapped infantry toward the gaps between his tanks. As they retreated under cover, Harker's men kept moving the smoke zones, leapfrogging their tanks backward in synchronized bursts, an improvised, moving curtain that turned confusion into strategy. From the enemy's perspective, it was a mystery. The smoke made it impossible to tell how many tanks were retreating, or where. German artillery began firing blind, wasting shells on empty ground while Harker's men silently slipped away. Inside one of the retreating half-tracks, Sergeant Wilson of the 19th Infantry couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Whoever's dropping that smoke," he muttered, "just saved our skins." For the next 45 minutes, the battlefield became a ghost town. The smoke rolled and twisted in the wind, making it impossible for the enemy to pursue effectively. Harker's tanks guided the retreating soldiers through a narrow gap toward a forested ridge, the only escape route not yet blocked. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, the Allied units were gone, leaving only drifting smoke and burning wrecks behind. When the surviving troops regrouped several miles away, the scale of what had happened became clear. 3 infantry units, more than 400 men, had been saved from annihilation. Out of Harker's company, only 2 tanks were lost. Against the odds, they had slipped through what should have been a perfect trap. But victory didn't come without a price. When command finally caught up to the retreating units, the first thing they demanded wasn't a report of survival, it was an explanation. Who authorized the use of smoke munitions? An operations officer asked coldly. Regulations were regulations, and unauthorized smoke deployment could mean court-martial. Harker stood silent for a long moment, helmet under his arm, uniform streaked with grime and ash. Then he simply said, "I did." The room went quiet. Some officers exchanged glances, others frowned. Harker braced himself for the reprimand. But before anyone could speak, one of the rescued infantry captains stepped forward. "If he hadn't," the man said, "none of us would be here to argue about it." The silence that followed said more than any report. Over the following weeks, as the front stabilized, word of Harker's, unauthorized, maneuver spread quietly through the ranks. Soldiers began calling it, Harker's curtain. What had started as a desperate gamble became an example of battlefield ingenuity, a symbol of how one commander's courage to act against orders could mean the difference between life and death. Officially, no commendation was ever written. The military bureaucracy buried the incident under vague language, tactical repositioning under limited visibility. But among those who'd been there, the legend lived on. Keynote. Courage over protocol. War tests more than skill, it tests judgment. Captain Harker's defiance wasn't rebellion for its own sake, it was the courage to trust his instincts when the rulebook offered no solution. In the chaos of battle, regulations can't see what a commander sees through the smoke and fire. Sometimes, leadership demands breaking the rules to save the people who follow them. Courage over protocol doesn't mean recklessness. It means knowing when the cost of hesitation outweighs the price of disobedience. Harker's choice wasn't about heroism, it was about responsibility. He understood that in war, waiting for permission can mean waiting too long. That single act, firing unauthorized smoke rounds, changed the outcome for 3 entire units. It reminded everyone who heard the story that the heart of leadership lies not in blind obedience, but in the moral clarity to do what's right when orders fail. When the war ended, Tommy Henshaw returned home quietly. He never sought medals or recognition. His homemade scope went with him, disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away in a wooden box. He returned to his old job as a gamekeeper, walking the same forests he had known since boyhood. To those who knew him, he was just a quiet man with a sharp eye and steady hands. Few knew that once, on a rain-soaked ridge in Italy, he had stopped a panzer with nothing but ingenuity and courage. Years later, when a young historian tracked him down for an interview, Henshaw showed him the scope. The brass had tarnished, and the glass was foggy with age. "Looks crude, doesn't it?" Henshaw said, smiling faintly. But it did the job. When the historian asked what made him trust such a makeshift piece of gear, Henshaw paused. "It's not about the scope," he said quietly. "It's about the man behind it, and whether he believes it'll work." In the grand scope of history, Tommy Henshaw's name never made it into the textbooks. He wasn't a general or a decorated hero. But among the veterans who served with him, his story became something more, a legend whispered around campfires and pubs long after the war ended. His homemade scope symbolized the very heart of wartime ingenuity, the idea that courage, skill, and creativity can turn even the simplest tools into instruments of victory. While others relied on factory-made precision, Henshaw trusted his hands, his instincts, and his belief that a man could make something extraordinary from the ordinary. And on that muddy ridge in Italy, with enemy armor closing in, he proved it. The soldiers who once laughed at his contraption never laughed again. Because they knew, when the chips were down, and the world seemed lost, it was one man's crazy idea that saved them all.